Sometimes the worst decisions turn out to be the best. Sometimes a man's last dollar becomes his greatest fortune. Caleb Vance was down to his final $500 when his ex-wife cornered him in town, demanding every cent. Instead of handing it over, he bought a condemned ranch at auction, a crumbling farmhouse everyone said was worthless. His ex-wife laughed, calling it expensive firewood. But when Caleb swung a sledgehammer at the rotting porch to start repairs, the wood splintered open to reveal something that would change everything. What he found hidden inside those hollow columns had been waiting since 1880. Could one act of defiance transform a man's entire life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun came up pale and hesitant over Cedar Bluff, Wyoming, casting long shadows across Main Street like it couldn't quite commit to the day ahead. Caleb Vance stood outside the first bank of Cedar Bluff, his hand resting on the worn leather satchel that held everything he owned worth counting. $500 in cash, $300 in coins. The rest, his dignity, his good name, his hope for something better, those had been spent years ago. He was 58 years old, though most days he felt closer to 80. The years hadn't been kind. Lines carved deep around his eyes told stories of too many seasons squinting into harsh winds, too many nights sleeping on hard ground, too many disappointments that settled into his bones like winter cold. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who'd worked hard his entire life and had little to show for it except the ache in his joints and the memories of what might have been. Caleb had been a cowboy once, back when that word still meant something. He'd worked the great cattle drives in his 20s, riding from Texas to Montana with thousands of head moving like a river of beef and dust. He'd been good at it too, respected by the trail bosses, trusted with the point position where only the best riders went. Those were the days when he believed hard work and honest effort would build a man a future worth having. Then he'd met Martha. Martha Calloway had been the prettiest girl in Cedar Bluff, maybe in all of Wyoming. Dark hair that caught the light like polished mahogany, eyes that seemed to see right through a man's defenses, and a smile that made promises she never intended to keep. Caleb had fallen hard and fast, the way young men do when they mistake beauty for substance and desire for compatibility. They'd married in the spring of 1887, and for exactly 6 months, Caleb had believed himself the luckiest man alive. The truth came slower, the way truth often does. Martha hadn't married him for love. She'd married him because she thought a man who could handle cattle and horses must have money saved up, must have prospects beyond the dusty streets of a small Wyoming town. When she discovered that Caleb was just another working cowboy with more sweat than silver, her affection cooled faster than coffee on a December morning. The divorce came 5 years later, after years of bitter arguments and cold silences. Martha got the house they'd been buying. Caleb had signed it over just to be done with the fighting. She got the furniture, the dishes, even the picture frames with their wedding photos still inside. Caleb got his freedom and a lesson about reading the fine print in people's hearts. That had been 23 years ago. And in all that time, Caleb had managed to rebuild his life into something resembling peace, if not prosperity. He'd worked ranches all over Wyoming and Montana, saved what he could, and eventually put together enough to buy a small string of horses he could hire out for work. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and it was his. Then came the winter of 1914, the winter that broke everything. A freak blizzard hit in November and didn't let up until March. Caleb lost all 7 of his horses, froze to death in a barn that collapsed under the weight of snow and ice. The insurance he'd paid for turned out to be worthless, the company having gone under 6 months earlier without bothering to inform its policyholders. By spring, Caleb was starting over again, this time with nothing but the clothes he wore and the $800 he'd managed to keep in the bank. He'd spent $300 of that over the summer on basics: food, a room at the boarding house, a decent saddle he could use to hire on for day work. Now he was down to his last $500, and the boarding house owner had made it clear that come October, if Caleb couldn't pay the full month's rent of $40, he'd be sleeping in the livery stable or under the stars. which brought him to this particular morning, standing outside the bank, trying to decide whether to withdraw his money or leave it where it was. In his pocket was a notice from the bank about some kind of auction happening at noon. Foreclosed properties, abandoned homesteads, the usual collection of broken dreams and failed ventures that small towns accumulated like dust. The bank door opened and Thomas Whitmore stepped out, nearly colliding with Caleb. Whitmore owned the Cedar Bluff Mercantile and half the commercial buildings on Main Street. He was a round man with a round face, the kind of prosperous that came from selling necessities to people who had no choice but to buy from him. "Morning, Caleb," Whitmore said, his tone friendly enough, though his eyes did a quick assessment of Caleb's worn boots and faded shirt. "Heading into the bank." "Thinking about it," Caleb said. "Well, if you're planning to bid on anything at the auction today, better get your cash in order. They're only taking immediate payment. No credit, no promises." Whitmore adjusted his hat. "Though between you and me, most of what they're selling isn't worth the paper the deeds are printed on. Bank's just trying to clear the books before the end of the year." "What kind of properties?" "Oh, the usual. Old Henderson place out past Willow Creek. Been empty since he died 2 years ago. The Morrison Ranch, though that's going to go for more than most folks around here can afford. And that wreck of a homestead they're calling Crow's Nest. That's the condemned one. Wouldn't surprise me if they end up paying someone to haul it away." Caleb nodded, only half listening. He was watching a figure approach from down the street, a woman in a blue dress that looked expensive, her hair styled in the fashion of women who had time and money to worry about such things. Even from a distance, he recognized the walk, the way she held her head slightly tilted, as if the world existed primarily for her evaluation. "Martha, I should get going," Whitmore said, following Caleb's gaze and understanding immediately. "Good luck today, Caleb, with whatever you decide to do." Caleb barely heard him leave. He was focused on Martha now, watching her cover the last 50 yards between them with the confidence of someone who believed she had the upper hand. She probably did. She usually did. "Caleb," she said when she reached him, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted something. "I thought I might find you here." "Martha." He kept his voice neutral, his face carefully blank. 23 years hadn't softened her beauty, but they had hardened something in her eyes, added lines around her mouth that spoke of chronic dissatisfaction rather than laughter. "I'll make this brief," she said, glancing around to see who might be watching. "I'm sure you remember our settlement agreement. I remember signing over everything I owned to you." "Yes, not everything. There was a clause about future support if my circumstances changed. And they have changed, Caleb. The hotel where I've been living is raising its rates. I need assistance." She said it matter-of-factly, as if requesting help with carrying groceries rather than demanding money from a man she divorced more than 2 decades ago. Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. "Martha, I'm not asking for much. $500 would cover 6 months at the new rate. Surely after all these years, you've managed to save at least that much. That's all I have." "Perfect. Then you can help me without any hardship." She smiled, and it was the smile that had convinced him to marry her all those years ago. Beautiful and empty and dangerous. "I've already spoken to Judge Morrison. He agrees that the settlement terms are binding. You can either give me the money voluntarily, or we can go back to court and let them take it from you, along with the legal fees." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the girl he'd married but the woman she'd become, someone who viewed other people as resources to be extracted rather than human beings to be respected. He thought about all the years he'd worked, all the setbacks he'd endured, all the times he'd started over when it would have been easier to quit. And here was Martha, who'd taken everything once before, coming back for the rest. Something shifted in him then, something that had been dormant for a very long time. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was more like a sudden clarity, a realization that he'd spent most of his adult life accommodating other people's wants and needs, while his own had gone permanently unfulfilled. "I'll tell you what, Martha," he said slowly. "I'll think about it. The auction's at noon. Meet me there, and I'll have an answer for you." She frowned, suspicious. "What does the auction have to do with anything? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But if you want your answer, that's where you'll get it." For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but something in his face must have convinced her he was serious. "Fine. Noon at the courthouse. But don't think you can avoid this, Caleb. That money is legally mine." She turned and walked away, her blue dress catching the morning light. Caleb watched her go and felt something close to freedom spreading through his chest. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Martha wasn't getting his last $500. Not today, not ever. He went into the bank, withdrew his money, and spent the next 2 hours walking the streets of Cedar Bluff, thinking about choices and consequences, and what a man did when he reached the point where he had nothing left to lose. By the time noon rolled around and the auction began, Caleb Vance had made a decision that would change everything. The Cedar Bluff courthouse sat at the end of Main Street like a tired sentinel, its white paint peeling in places, its steps worn smooth by decades of people coming to settle disputes and conduct business. By the time Caleb arrived, a crowd of maybe 40 people had gathered on the front lawn, talking in small groups while they waited for the auction to begin. Caleb spotted Martha immediately. She stood near the front, talking to Judge Morrison's wife, her posture radiating confidence. She glanced up as Caleb approached, her expression expectant. He ignored her and found a spot toward the back of the crowd, next to old Ben Parker, who ran the feed store. "Didn't figure you for a bidder today," Ben said, nodding hello. "Just curious," Caleb replied. At exactly noon, County Clerk Harold Stevens climbed onto a wooden platform that had been set up for the occasion. He was a thin man with spectacles and a nervous habit of clearing his throat before speaking. In his hands, he held a ledger and a wooden gavel that looked older than the courthouse itself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Stevens began, "welcome to the Cedar Bluff County Quarterly Property Auction. Today, we have 7 properties available for immediate purchase. All sales are final. Payment must be rendered in full immediately following successful bid. No exceptions." He cleared his throat. "Let's begin with parcel number 1. The Henderson Homestead, 40 acres with a 2-room cabin, located 8 miles north of town on Willow Creek. The bidding was lackluster. The Henderson place had been empty for 2 years, and everyone knew the cabin's roof had collapsed last winter. It finally went to a rancher from the next county over for $200, probably buying it just for the water rights to the creek. The Morrison Ranch came next, and the bidding was more spirited. It was a real property, 300 acres with good grazing and a solid house. The price climbed steadily. 800, 900, 1,200. Caleb watched Martha watching the bidding, her face showing nothing. When it sold for 1,400 to a cattle broker from Cheyenne, she didn't even blink. They worked through 4 more properties, a commercial lot on Main Street, a small house that needed repairs, a strip of land near the railroad that might be valuable someday. With each property sold, Caleb felt the cash in his pocket growing heavier, more significant. $500, his entire safety net. The only thing standing between him and complete destitution. Finally, Stevens consulted his ledger and cleared his throat again. "Last item today, folks. Parcel number 7, the property known locally as Crow's Nest, 120 acres with structures, located 12 miles west of town off the old Territorial Road." He paused. "I should mention that the county inspector has condemned the main structure as unsafe for habitation. Property is being sold is for land value only." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Everyone in Cedar Bluff knew about Crow's Nest. It had been built by Silas Blackwood back in the 1870s, a strange hermit who'd made money somehow, no one quite knew how, and then spent his final years alone in that house, trusting no one. He died in 1910, and in the 4 years since, the property had fallen into severe disrepair. The windows were gone, the roof sagged dangerously, and the porch looked ready to collapse under its own weight. "We'll start the bidding at $50, Stevens announced. Silence. No one raised a hand. $50 for 120 acres. Stevens tried again. "Come now, folks. Even as timber value. This is worth something." More silence. Someone in the crowd muttered something about not wanting to pay for the privilege of hauling away trash, and a few people chuckled. Caleb felt Martha's eyes on him. He glanced over and saw her watching him with that calculating expression he remembered from their marriage. The look she got when she was working through a problem and getting close to a solution she didn't like. $25. Stevens said, his voice carrying a hint of desperation. 25 for 120 acres. In that moment, watching Martha watch him, Caleb understood something fundamental. If he gave her his $500, she would take it and come back for more. She would always come back for more. There would always be another expense, another need, another legal maneuver to extract whatever he managed to scrape together. He could work himself into the grave and it would never be enough, because Martha didn't want his money. She wanted his defeat. He could give her the money and spend the rest of his life working for someone else, living in rented rooms, always one disaster away from having nothing. Or he could do something different. $500, Caleb said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. Every head turned to look at him. Harold Stevens actually dropped his gavel, fumbling to catch it before it hit the platform. Judge Morrison's wife gasped audibly. Ben Parker beside him whispered, "Lord above, Caleb, what are you doing?" But Caleb was watching Martha, and the expression on her face made everything worth it. Shock, then understanding, then fury, all of it flashing across her features in the space of 3 heartbeats. "Did I hear $500? Stevens managed, finding his voice again. "You did," Caleb confirmed. Martha pushed through the crowd toward him, her face flushed. "Caleb, don't be ridiculous. That property isn't worth $50, much less $500. Then I guess I'm making a bad investment." Caleb said calmly, "You can't do this. That's my money. It's my money, Martha. It's been my money for 23 years, and I'm spending it on property." Stevens cleared his throat loudly. "I have a bid of $500 for Parcel 7. Do I hear any other bids?" He waited exactly 3 seconds. Hearing none, Parcel 7 is sold to Mr. Caleb Vance for $500. "Sir, please come forward to complete the transaction." The crowd parted as Caleb walked to the platform, very aware of Martha following behind him, her voice low and fierce. "You just bought a pile of firewood, you stupid, stubborn fool. That house is going to collapse on you, and then what will you have? Nothing. Just like you've always had nothing." Caleb reached the platform and pulled out his cash. He counted it carefully, $500 exactly, and handed it to Harold Stevens. In return, Stevens gave him a deed, an official-looking document with the county seal and a description of the property boundaries. The paper felt old and slightly brittle, but the ink was clear enough. "Congratulations on your purchase, Mr. Vance," Stevens said formally, though his eyes suggested he thought Caleb had lost his mind. Caleb folded the deed carefully and put it in his pocket. He turned to face Martha, who stood 3 feet away, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "That money was supposed to support me," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You just threw it away out of spite." "No," Caleb said quietly. "I just bought myself a piece of ground. Maybe it's worthless. Maybe it'll fall down tomorrow, but it's mine, Martha. For the first time in a very long time, I own something that nobody can take away from me." "You're going to regret this," she hissed. "Maybe," Caleb acknowledged. "But at least it'll be my regret, my choice, not yours." He walked away from her, through the crowd that parted again, people staring at him like he'd just done something either very brave or very insane. Ben Parker caught his arm as he passed. "You need any help out there?" Ben asked. "Moving your things? Looking the place over?" "I appreciate it, Ben, but I think I need to face this one alone." He walked back to the boarding house, packed his few belongings into a canvas bag, settled his account with the owner, and by 2 o'clock that afternoon was riding a borrowed horse west on the old territorial road, the deed to Crow's Nest in his pocket, and absolutely no idea what he'd just done to his life. The only thing he knew for certain was that he'd rather own a condemned shack than hand another dollar to Martha Vance. Everything else he'd figure out as he went. The old territorial road hadn't been properly maintained in years. What had once been a main route west was now little more than 2 faint tracks through sagebrush and prairie grass, marked here and there by weathered posts that the wind had tilted at odd angles. Caleb rode slowly, letting the borrowed horse pick its way across the uneven ground, and tried not to think too hard about what he'd just done. $500, his entire reserve, gone in a moment of defiance. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon when he spotted the property. It sat in a shallow valley where 3 hills came together, creating a natural shelter from the worst of the winter winds. Someone, presumably Silas Blackwood, had chosen the location well. There was a creek running along the northern boundary, still flowing despite the late season, and stands of cottonwood trees that would provide shade in summer. But the house. Caleb brought the horse to a stop about 50 yards out and just stared. Martha had called it expensive firewood, and she hadn't been far wrong. The structure had been a decent-sized farmhouse once, maybe 40 feet long and 20 wide, built in the simple rectangular style common to homesteaders in the 1870s. But 4 years of neglect had done what 4 decades of weather had only threatened. The roof sagged in the middle like a swayback horse. The windows were completely gone, leaving dark, empty rectangles that made the house look like a skull staring back at him. The front porch tilted dangerously to one side, supported by 4 thick columns that somehow still held, despite looking like they'd rot through if you breathed on them too hard. The outbuildings weren't much better. A barn that had lost most of its roof. A chicken coop that had collapsed entirely. A well with a wooden cover that looked solid enough, at least from this distance. Caleb dismounted slowly, his joints protesting after the long ride. He tied the horse to what remained of a hitching post and approached the house on foot, each step feeling like it took him further from any reasonable course of action and deeper into pure foolishness. The porch steps creaked alarmingly when he tested them with his weight. The third step broke through completely, old wood crumbling like stale bread. Caleb stepped over it carefully and made it to the porch itself, which groaned but held. Through the open doorway, he could see the interior. Bare floors covered in debris, walls stained with water damage, a stone fireplace that looked intact but was probably full of animal nests. He pulled the deed from his pocket and unfolded it, reading the property description again in the fading light. 120 acres, buildings and improvements, water rights to the unnamed creek. It was all his. Every rotted board, every broken window, every square foot of this disaster was legally and irrevocably his property. A laugh bubbled up in his chest, surprising him. It wasn't a happy laugh exactly, but it wasn't entirely bitter either. It was the laugh of a man who just jumped off a cliff and hadn't hit the ground yet. That strange moment between the decision and the consequence where anything seemed possible. He walked around the entire house slowly, taking inventory. The back wall was in slightly better shape than the front. The stone foundation looked solid. The well, when he tested it, had clear water about 15 feet down. The barn, despite the missing roof, had sturdy walls and might be salvageable for storage. By the time he'd completed his circuit, night was falling fast. Caleb unsaddled the horse, hobbled it near the creek where the grass was good, and made camp in what had once been the barn. He'd brought supplies. A bedroll, some food, matches, a lantern. He built a small fire in a cleared space, ate some jerky and hardtack, and sat staring at the flames while darkness settled over Crow's Nest. His father had been a homesteader, back before the big cattle companies bought up all the good land. Caleb remembered watching him work from sunrise to sunset, breaking ground that had never known a plow, hauling stones for fences, cutting timber for buildings. His father had believed in the land the way other men believed in God. Absolutely, and without reservation. A man who owns land owns possibility, his father used to say. Everything else is just borrowing time. His father had lost that land to drought and debt, had died working another man's ranch for wages, but he'd never stopped believing. Never stopped thinking that somewhere out there was a piece of ground with his name on it. Caleb pulled the deed out again, holding it close to the firelight. His name was on this ground now. Caleb Vance, owner of 120 acres of possibility or catastrophe. He wasn't sure which yet. He slept fitfully that night, waking at every sound. The wind in the cottonwoods, the creek murmuring over stones, an owl hunting somewhere in the darkness. Sounds he'd heard thousands of times in his life, but tonight they seemed to carry questions. What now? What next? What had he been thinking? Morning came cold and clear, frost on the ground, his breath visible in the dawn light. Caleb woke stiff and sore, feeling every one of his 58 years. He built up the fire, made coffee in a battered tin pot, and tried to form some kind of plan. The house was the obvious problem. He couldn't live in it as it was. The roof would come down in the first serious snow, but maybe he could make one room livable. patch enough to have shelter while he figured out what to do next. He'd need tools. He'd need lumber. He'd need about 10,000 things he didn't have and no money to buy them with. But he'd have time to figure it out. Because Martha couldn't take this away from him. That thought alone was worth more than $500. After breakfast, Caleb saddled the horse and rode back toward town. He'd need to return the borrowed animal, collect what few things he'd left at the boarding house, and see about getting some basic supplies on credit. Ben Parker had always been fair about extending credit to men who'd proven themselves reliable. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was a start. The territorial road looked different in morning light. Less ominous, more just old and forgotten. Like Caleb himself, maybe. Old and forgotten and trying to find a reason to matter again. He passed a marker stone that indicated the 12-mile point from Cedar Bluff. 12 miles. Close enough to get supplies, but far enough that he wouldn't have to see Martha every day. That alone felt like a victory. Behind him, Crow's Nest sat in its valley, waiting. The house looked no better in daylight than it had at dusk, but somehow Caleb felt different about it. It wasn't just a mistake anymore. It wasn't just expensive firewood. It was a challenge, and challenges were something Caleb understood. You faced them one day at a time, one problem at a time, until either you won or you knew for certain you'd given it everything you had. He kicked the horse into a gentle trot, already mentally cataloging what he'd need. Hammer, nails, saw, rope, tar paper for the roof. Maybe he could salvage lumber from the collapsed outbuildings. Maybe he could. The possibilities began to multiply, and for the first time since Martha had cornered him outside the bank, Caleb felt something other than resignation. He felt something that might have been hope, or might have just been stubbornness. With Caleb Vance, those two things had always been hard to tell apart. Cedar Bluff looked different to Caleb when he rode in late that morning. The buildings seemed smaller, somehow less permanent. He'd spent most of his life moving from town to town, always living in someone else's space, always temporary. Now he had land. It changed how he saw everything else. He returned the borrowed horse to Jim Morrison at the livery stable, thanking him for the loan. Morrison took the reins and studied Caleb's face like he was looking for signs of insanity or enlightenment. "How bad is it out there?" Morrison asked. "Bad enough," Caleb admitted. "But standing, you really going to try fixing that place up?" "I really am." Morrison shook his head slowly. "Well, I'll say this for you. You've got sand. Most men your age would be looking for easy chairs and quiet corners. You're taking on a project that would test a man half your years." "Maybe that's the point," Caleb said. "At my age, you either keep moving or you start dying. I'd rather keep moving." He walked to Ben Parker's feed store, the bell above the door jangling as he entered. The familiar smell of grain and leather and tobacco hit him, a smell he'd known all his life, comforting in its constancy. Ben was behind the counter, weighing out seed for a farmer Caleb didn't recognize. When the customer left, Ben turned to Caleb with a raised eyebrow. "So, you still a property owner this morning, or did common sense catch up with you overnight?" "Still an owner," Caleb said. "In fact, I'm here to buy on credit if you're willing." Ben pulled out a ledger, flipping to a fresh page. "Depends what you need. I can carry you for basics if you're good for it, come spring." "I'm good for it. Might take me longer than spring to pay, but I'll pay every cent." They spent the next 20 minutes putting together a list. Nails, hammer, saw, rope, a small amount of lumber for essential repairs, tar paper, a tarp for temporary shelter. Ben kept a running total, his pencil scratching across the ledger paper. When they finished, the total came to $87. "I can give you $50 worth today," Ben said. "The rest you'll need to wait on. I can't extend more than that without risking my own situation." "50's enough to start," Caleb agreed. "I appreciate it, Ben. You'll pay me back in labor if it comes to it. I can always use help moving freight." Ben started pulling items from the shelves behind him, stacking them on the counter. "Word's already spread about what you did yesterday. You're either the bravest man in Cedar Bluff or the most foolish." "Probably foolish," Caleb said. "But it's done now. Martha came by earlier, asking about you." Ben kept his voice neutral. "Wanted to know if you'd been in, if I knew what your plans were." "What did you tell her?" "Told her I mind my own business and suggested she do the same." Ben wrapped the tools in canvas. "She's not taking this well, Caleb. Whatever satisfaction you got from yesterday, it came at the cost of making a permanent enemy. We've been enemies for 20 years, Ben. Yesterday just made it official." The door jangled again, and Thomas Whitmore came in, stopping short when he saw Caleb. "Heard you were back in town. How's your new estate?" There was no mockery in his voice, just genuine curiosity, but Caleb heard the subtext anyway. Everyone wanted to know if he regretted it yet. "Needs work," Caleb said simply. "Most things worth having do." Whitmore nodded to Ben. "Put together a care package for Mr. Vance, would you? Coffee, beans, flour, bacon, basic supplies. Put it on my account." Caleb straightened. "That's not necessary. It's necessary," Whitmore interrupted. "Man's got to eat while he's working. Consider it a housewarming gift." He extended his hand. "Welcome to property ownership, Caleb. However it turns out, you took a stand. That counts for something in my book." They shook hands, and Caleb felt something unfamiliar. Community support. Not charity, not pity, but respect from one property owner to another. It made the last day's decision feel slightly less insane. He loaded his supplies onto a rented wagon, added the food stores from Whitmore, and was preparing to leave when he saw Martha coming down the boardwalk toward him. She'd seen him too, and there was no avoiding her without making a scene. "Caleb," she said, stopping a few feet away. In daylight, she looked older than she had yesterday, the strain of anger showing in the lines around her mouth. "I've spoken to Judge Morrison. He says there's no legal recourse to reverse the transaction." "I figured as much. So you're really going through with this? Living in that wreck?" She gestured at the wagon loaded with supplies. "Trying to rebuild something that should have been torn down years ago?" "Yes. Why?" The question came out sharper than she probably intended. Genuine confusion mixing with the anger. "Why throw everything away just to spite me?" Caleb looked at her for a long moment, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. "It's not spite, Martha. It's choice. All my life, I've made the safe decision, the reasonable decision. I worked for other men, lived in other men's buildings, saved money in other men's banks. And where did it get me? To 58 years old, with nothing I could call my own except the clothes I wear." He gestured at the wagon. "That property might be worthless. Probably is worthless, but it's mine. For once in my life, I own something that nobody can take away. Not you, not the bank, not bad luck. That's worth $500 to me." "You could have helped me," she said quietly. "I spent 5 years trying to help you, Martha. It was never enough then. It wouldn't have been enough now." He climbed onto the wagon seat. "I hope you find what you're looking for. I truly do, but you won't find it in my pocket anymore." He clicked to the horse, and the wagon rolled forward. Martha stood watching him go, and for just a moment, Caleb saw something in her face that might have been regret, or might have just been frustration at losing an easy mark. The ride back to Crow's Nest took 3 hours. The wagon was slower than a saddle horse, and Caleb had to pick his way carefully over the rough road. But the supplies rattled behind him, proof of forward momentum, and the afternoon sun was warm on his shoulders. By the time he spotted his property in the distance, Caleb had made his peace with whatever came next. He pulled the wagon up near the house and began unloading. Every tool he set down, every board he stacked, felt like a small act of defiance against the life he'd been living. He'd been treading water for decades. Now he was either going to swim or sink, but at least he'd do it on his own terms. The sun was setting when he finished unloading. Caleb stood in front of the sagging porch, a sledgehammer in his hands, the heaviest tool Ben had included in the supplies, and studied the structure. The porch had to come down. It was too dangerous to leave standing, and he couldn't fix it without understanding what was underneath. He raised the sledgehammer, feeling the weight of it, feeling the weight of the decision behind it. One swing, and he'd be committed. One swing, and there'd be no pretending this was reversible. Caleb swung the hammer hard into the nearest porch column, right at shoulder height. The wood splintered and cracked, and his new life began. The sledgehammer hit the porch column with a solid crack, and the wood gave way easier than Caleb had expected. The outer layer splintered, revealing... Caleb stopped mid-swing, frowning. The column wasn't solid wood. It was hollow. He set the sledgehammer down and examined the damage more closely. The column had been built in sections, a thick outer shell of timber encasing an interior space about 6 inches square. Through the hole he'd just made, he could see something inside. Not empty space, but some kind of material wrapped in oilcloth. Caleb's heart began to beat faster, though he couldn't have said why. He picked up the sledgehammer again and struck the column lower down, then again higher up. The wood came away in chunks, old but still solid enough to require real force. Whatever this column had been designed to hide, it had been built to last. When he'd cleared away enough of the outer shell, Caleb reached inside and pulled out the first package. It was heavy, surprisingly so, wrapped in layers of oilcloth that had been tied with twine. The cloth was stained and brittle, but had held up remarkably well. His hands shook slightly as he unwrapped it. Gold coins spilled out onto the porch floor, gleaming in the fading sunlight. Caleb stared at them, his brain struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. They were $20 gold pieces, double eagles, each one stamped with the year 1880 and the profile of liberty. He counted them slowly. 20 coins in the first package, $400 in gold. His breath came short. His mind raced. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of mistake, some kind of... He grabbed the sledgehammer and attacked the column with renewed vigor, tearing away more of the outer shell. 2 more packages fell out, each wrapped in the same oilcloth, each containing the same heavy weight. Caleb opened them both, his hands working faster now, and more gold coins scattered across the porch. 20 in the second package, 20 in the third. $1,200 in gold, hidden inside a single porch column. Caleb sat down hard on the tilted porch, the coins surrounding him like a gold-colored dream. His mind went to Silas Blackwood, the hermit who'd built this house, who'd lived here alone for 40 years, who died without leaving any known heirs. Everyone in Cedar Bluff had assumed Blackwood was just another crazy old prospector who'd never struck it rich. But what if they'd been wrong? What if Blackwood had struck it rich and simply hidden his wealth where no one would think to look? The other 3 porch columns stood intact, each one identical to the first. Caleb got to his feet, legs unsteady, and approached the second column. He swung the sledgehammer with purpose now, tearing away the outer shell in great chunks. More oilcloth packages tumbled out. 6 in this column, each containing 20 double eagles. $2,400. The third column yielded the same. The fourth held 7 packages. By the time full darkness fell, Caleb had demolished all 4 porch columns and sat surrounded by 26 packages of gold coins. He'd stopped counting individual coins after the first column. The numbers had become too large, too impossible to comprehend. Instead, he counted packages, doing the math in his head. 26 packages, 20 coins per package, 520 coins total. At $20 per coin, that was $10,400 in gold, hidden in his porch. Caleb started to laugh. He couldn't help it. The laugh built in his chest and burst out into the darkness, echoing across the valley. He'd spent $500 on this property, his last $500, every cent he had in the world, and he'd just found more than 20 times that amount hidden in timber that everyone, including him, had assumed was worthless. Martha had called it expensive firewood. Judge Morrison's wife had gasped in shock at the purchase. Half the town probably thought he'd lost his mind, and they'd all been wrong. Caleb gathered the packages carefully, rewrapping each one in its oilcloth, and carried them into the barn where he'd made his camp. He cleared a space in the corner, moved aside some old hay, and found a gap between 2 foundation stones where he could hide the gold temporarily. It took 4 trips to move all 26 packages, and by the time he finished, his arms ached and his heart was still racing. He built up his campfire and sat staring at the flames, trying to think clearly. The gold changed. Everything. But he had to be smart about this. If word got out that he'd found $10,000 in gold, every thief and opportunist within 100 miles would descend on Crow's Nest. He'd be robbed or killed or both. No one could know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He thought about Silas Blackwood, dying alone in this house 4 years ago, taking the secret of the gold to his grave. What kind of man hides that much wealth in his porch columns? Someone who didn't trust banks, obviously. Someone who'd been betrayed before. or thought he might be. Someone who'd rather see his fortune rot into the ground than risk losing it to someone else. Caleb understood that impulse now, perhaps better than he ever had before. In the last 24 hours, he'd gone from having $500 to having nothing to having more money than he'd earned in the last 10 years combined. The emotional whiplash was dizzying. But underneath the shock and the disbelief, a plan was forming. He couldn't spend the gold all at once. That would raise too many questions. But he could convert it gradually, carefully. Take a few coins at a time to a bank in Cheyenne or Laramie, somewhere far enough away that people wouldn't connect it to Caleb Vance of Cedar Bluff. Build up a legitimate bank account slowly. Use the money to actually restore Crow's Nest, to build something real and lasting. And then the thought came to him fully formed, beautiful in its symmetry. Martha lived in the Cedar Bluff Hotel, paying $60 a month for a suite she could barely afford. The hotel had been for sale for the last year, the owner wanting to retire but finding no buyers willing to pay his asking price of $8,000. Caleb could buy the hotel. He could buy it outright, cash money, and become Martha's landlord. He could give her a choice, pay her rent on time or find somewhere else to live. He could watch her face when she realized that the condemned property she'd mocked had made him wealthy while she was still scraping by on what she could extract from others. The revenge would be perfect because it wouldn't be revenge at all. It would just be business, clean, legal, and absolutely devastating. Caleb lay down on his bedroll, staring up at the barn's damaged roof where stars showed through the gaps. Somewhere out there, Martha was probably in a hotel room, celebrating her narrow escape from having to live without his $500. She had no idea that her mockery and her greed had just cost her everything. Sleep came slowly. And when it did, Caleb dreamed of gold coins falling like rain, covering Cedar Bluff in a glittering flood that lifted him up while everyone else scrambled to stay afloat. It wasn't a kind dream, but kindness was something he'd given up on when he swung that sledgehammer into the first column. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb Vance went to sleep, feeling like a rich man. Morning came gray and cold, a bank of clouds moving in from the west promising rain or early snow. Caleb woke stiff and disoriented, momentarily forgetting where he was and why. Then memory returned in a rush. The auction, the sledgehammer, the gold coins spilling out across the porch. He sat up quickly, his heart hammering. Had it been real, or had exhaustion and stress created an elaborate dream? He scrambled to the corner of the barn where he'd hidden the packages, moving aside the hay and pulling out one of the oilcloth bundles. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it. 20 gold double eagles gleamed in the dim morning light, solid and heavy and undeniably real. Caleb exhaled slowly, letting the reality settle over him. He was holding $400 in his hands. Behind him, hidden in the barn wall, were 25 more packages just like this one. He hadn't dreamed it. He was, by any reasonable measure, a wealthy man. The question was what to do about it. He rewrapped the coins carefully and tucked the package back into its hiding place. Then he took just one coin, a single double eagle, and slipped it into his pocket. If he was going to make plans, he needed to verify that the gold was genuine and could actually be converted to usable currency. After a quick breakfast of coffee and hardtack, Caleb hitched the rented wagon and headed back towards Cedar Bluff. The ride gave him time to think, to process what had happened. Silas Blackwood had been dead for 4 years. Whatever wealth he'd accumulated, he'd left no will, no heirs, no instructions. The property had gone to the county for unpaid taxes, and the county had sold it at auction, which meant the gold was legally Caleb's. He hadn't stolen it, hadn't cheated anyone. He'd simply bought a piece of property and discovered what came with it, like finding a jar of coins buried in a backyard or a lost painting in an attic. Finders keepers, as the saying went. But that didn't make it feel any less surreal. He passed 2 riders heading west, ranch hands he recognized, but whose names he didn't know. They nodded in greeting, and Caleb nodded back, very aware of the single gold coin in his pocket that weighed more than all their combined weekly wages. In Cedar Bluff, he returned the wagon to Morrison's livery and paid the rental fee, $2 that left him with exactly 17 cents to his name in actual cash. The irony wasn't lost on him. Wealthiest man in town, and he couldn't buy a meal without converting some of his hidden gold first. He walked to the First Bank of Cedar Bluff and found the manager, Albert Sutton, in his office reviewing ledgers. Sutton was a careful man in his 50s, precise in his speech and conservative in his lending. He looked up when Caleb entered, surprise crossing his face. "Mr. Vance, I heard about your purchase at the auction. Quite the bold move." "It's been educational," Caleb said carefully. "I have a question about currency exchange." "Oh?" Sutton set down his pen, giving Caleb his full attention. "If a man had some old gold coins, double eagles, say from the 1880s, would they still have value? Could they be exchanged for currency or deposited?" Sutton's expression sharpened with interest. "Absolutely. Gold is gold, regardless of the minting date. In fact, older coins sometimes carry a premium for collectors. Where would this hypothetical man have acquired such coins?" "Family inheritance," Caleb said smoothly. "Old trunk in an attic, that sort of thing." "I see." Sutton didn't quite believe him, but he was too polite to say so directly. "Well, if your friend wanted to convert gold to currency, he'd need to verify authenticity first. We could do that here. We have a scale and testing acids. Then we'd exchange at the current rate, which is $20 per double eagle, same as face value. And if someone wanted to deposit multiple coins over time, we'd be happy to accommodate that. Though I'd recommend spreading such transactions across multiple institutions if the amounts are significant. Diversification protects against bank failures." Sutton leaned back in his chair. "Is your friend thinking of making a deposit soon?" Caleb pulled the single double eagle from his pocket and set it on the desk. "I'd like to verify this one, if you don't mind." Sutton's eyebrows rose, but he picked up the coin with professional composure and examined it closely. He pulled out a jeweler's loupe, studying the details, then retrieved a small set of scales from a drawer. The coin weighed exactly as it should. He made a tiny scratch on the edge, so small Caleb could barely see it, and applied a drop of acid. The gold didn't react. "Genuine," Sutton declared. 1880 mintage, excellent condition. This is worth exactly $20, plus perhaps $1 or $2 to the right collector. "I'd like to deposit it," Caleb said. "Open an account, of course." Sutton pulled out the necessary forms. "We'll need some basic information. Current address, employment." "Crow's Nest. That's the property I bought yesterday. And I'm self-employed as a property owner now, I suppose." Something flickered in Sutton's eyes. Recognition. Calculation. He was putting pieces together, and Caleb could almost see the thoughts forming. Man buys condemned property for $500. Shows up the next day with gold coins from the 1880s. The timing was suspicious, but not necessarily illegal. "Very well," Sutton said, filling out the forms. "I'll credit $20 to your new account. Will there be additional deposits in the future?" "Possibly. Small amounts as I find them." "Understood." Sutton completed the paperwork and handed Caleb a receipt. "Welcome to the First Bank of Cedar Bluff, Mr. Vance. I trust this will be the beginning of a profitable relationship." Caleb left the bank with his receipt and a strange feeling in his chest. Relief mixed with anxiety. The gold was real. It could be converted. But he'd just revealed to the bank manager that he had access to old gold coins, and Sutton was smart enough to wonder where they'd come from. He'd have to be more careful going forward. Maybe take some coins to Cheyenne, like he'd originally planned. Spread the deposits out, keep the amounts small enough to avoid attention. He walked back through town, passing the hotel where Martha lived. Through the front window, he could see the lobby, tired furniture, faded carpet, the worn grandeur of a place that had seen better days. The owner, Chester Hall, sat behind the desk reading a newspaper, looking old and tired himself. $8,000, Caleb thought. That's what Hall wanted for this place. $8,000 to own the building where Martha had made her home, where she felt safe and superior. Caleb had that much in his barn right now, with $2,000 left over. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Power was something he'd never had before. Power to change his circumstances, to influence others, to make decisions that mattered beyond just his own survival. It felt dangerous, like handling a loaded gun for the first time. He turned away from the hotel and headed for Ben Parker's feed store. He had legitimate supplies to buy, and now he had the money to pay for them. Or would have, once he converted more gold. But he'd have to be patient, careful. Rush this and he'd destroy everything before he could enjoy it. Ben was arranging sacks of grain when Caleb entered. Back already? Don't tell me you've finished all those supplies. Not yet. Just wanted to let you know I'll be able to pay off my account sooner than expected. Found some family money I'd forgotten about. It was a weak lie, but Ben didn't question it. That's good news. Always nice when unexpected fortune comes along. It is, Caleb agreed. Though it comes with its own complications. Doesn't everything? Ben said philosophically. Money solves some problems and creates others. The trick is making sure the problems it creates are better than the ones it solves. Caleb thought about that as he walked back to where he'd left Morrison's borrowed horse. Better problems. That was one way to think about sudden wealth. He'd traded the problem of poverty for the problem of keeping a secret, of managing something valuable, of deciding what kind of man he wanted to be now that he had choices. The ride back to Crow's Nest gave him more time to think. By the time he arrived, the clouds had opened up and rain was falling steadily, turning the valley into a gray watercolor painting. Caleb sat in the barn, listening to rain drum on what remained of the roof, and thought about foundations. The house needed one, a new foundation to replace whatever had rotted away over the years. His life needed one too. He'd been drifting for so long, building on sand, never quite stable. Now he had a chance to build on bedrock, to create something solid that would last. But first, he had to decide what kind of building he wanted to construct. The gold gave him resources. The question was what he'd build with them. The rain continued through the afternoon and into the evening, a steady drumming that turned the ground around Crow's Nest into mud. Caleb spent the time sorting through the debris inside the house, looking for anything salvageable and trying to determine the extent of the repairs needed. The interior was worse than the exterior. Water damage everywhere, floorboards rotted through in places, and evidence of animals having nested in nearly every room. In what had once been the main bedroom, Caleb found a trunk pushed against the far wall, hidden under a pile of collapsed plaster and broken lath. The trunk was old, heavy oak with iron bands, and remarkably intact despite the decay around it. He dragged it clear of the debris and tried the latch. Locked. He went back to the barn for tools and returned with a crowbar. The lock was old, but solid, and it took several minutes of prying before the hasp broke free. Caleb lifted the lid slowly, half expecting more gold, half expecting nothing but moth-eaten clothes. What he found was paper. Hundreds of pages, all carefully organized in bound journals and loose sheaves tied with string. Caleb lifted out the top journal and opened it. The handwriting was precise, methodical. The ink faded, but still legible. At the top of the first page was written, "Personal account of Silas Blackwood, begun January 1870. Caleb sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and began to read. The journals told a story he hadn't expected. Silas Blackwood hadn't been a prospector or a hermit by choice. He'd been a banker in San Francisco, a respectable man with a wife and 2 children. In 1869, he discovered that his partner, a man named James Dalton, had been embezzling from their clients, using the bank's resources to fund railway speculation that had gone disastrously wrong. Blackwood had tried to make it right. He'd used his own savings to cover the losses, had confronted Dalton, had threatened to go to the authorities. In response, Dalton had framed Blackwood for the embezzlement, producing forged documents that made it look like Blackwood had been the criminal all along. The scandal destroyed everything. Blackwood's reputation, his marriage, his life in San Francisco. Rather than face trial for crimes he hadn't committed, he'd fled with what remained of his personal wealth, approximately $12,000 in gold, his life savings combined with what he'd managed to withdraw from the bank before Dalton could seize it. He'd come to Wyoming Territory to disappear, buying land under a different name, building a house far from anyone who might recognize him. The journals documented his transformation from respected banker to isolated hermit, page after page of bitterness and paranoia. He Wrote about hiding his gold because he couldn't trust banks anymore, couldn't trust people, couldn't trust anything except the security of his own hands and his own hiding places. But the twist came in a later journal, dated 1908, 2 years before Blackwood's death. "Today I received a letter," Blackwood had written. "After all these years, the truth has finally emerged. James Dalton is dead, died in a railway accident in 1905. With his death, his personal effects were examined, and among them were documents proving his guilt in the San Francisco banking scandal of 1869. The Bank Commission has issued a formal apology. They want me to return to San Francisco to clear my name officially, to reclaim my position in society." Caleb read faster, turning pages, following the story. "I find that I cannot go back. Too much time has passed. My wife is dead, my children grown and convinced of my guilt. What would I return to? The life I had is gone, and I am not the man I was. The gold remains hidden. If I die before reclaiming it, then perhaps someone worthier will find it someday. Someone who needs a second chance more than I need vindication." The final journal entry was dated November 1910, just weeks before Blackwood's death. "I am old and sick and ready to leave this world. I think often of the man I was before the scandal, before the running, before the years of isolation. I wonder if he would recognize what I have become. But I have learned something in these 40 years alone. Wealth means nothing without trust, and trust is the hardest thing to rebuild once broken. To whoever finds this account, use the gold I have hidden well. Use it to build something real, something honest. Do not make my mistake of trusting only yourself. Trust is the foundation of everything worthwhile, and I forgot that too late." Caleb closed the journal slowly, his hands shaking slightly. Silas Blackwood hadn't been a crazy hermit. He'd been a broken man, destroyed by betrayal, spending 40 years in exile for crimes he hadn't committed. The gold wasn't stolen wealth, it was Blackwood's legitimate fortune, hidden because he'd learned the hard way that trusting institutions could destroy you. But there was more in the trunk. Beneath the journals, Caleb found a leather portfolio containing official documents. Letters from the San Francisco Bank Commission, dated 1908, confirming Dalton's guilt and apologizing for the false accusations against Blackwood. A deed to property in San Francisco, still in Blackwood's original name, Richard Whitfield. A will, unsigned, leaving everything to the person who has the courage to start over where I failed. And at the very bottom, a letter sealed with wax, addressed simply, "To the new owner of this property." Caleb broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shakier than in the journals, written by a man whose health was failing. "If you are reading this, then you have found my home and perhaps my gold. You likely paid very little for this property, as it has fallen into disrepair, and I am certainly dead. Consider this a gift from one man to another, with one condition. Do not let fear rule your decisions as it ruled mine. I spent 40 years afraid of betrayal, afraid of trusting, afraid of being hurt again. In protecting myself, I lost everything worth having. The gold brought me no joy because I never used it for anything except hiding it better. Do not make my mistake. Use the wealth I leave behind to build something. Trust someone. Take a risk. Live the life I was too frightened to live." Caleb sat in the ruined bedroom, surrounded by Blackwood's journals and letters, and felt the weight of the dead man's story settling over him like a coat. He'd thought finding the gold made him lucky, but luck was just opportunity, and what he did with it would determine whether Blackwood's sacrifice had meant anything. He thought about his plan to buy the hotel, to become Martha's landlord, to get revenge for every slight and disappointment. It was exactly the kind of isolated, fearful thinking that had destroyed Blackwood's life. Use wealth to protect yourself, to control others, to make sure you could never be hurt again. Blackwood's final words echoed in his mind. Do not let fear rule your decisions. The rain had stopped. Through the broken window, Caleb could see evening sun breaking through the clouds, casting long golden rays across the valley. The light hit the destroyed porch where he'd found the gold, illuminating the splintered columns and scattered debris. He gathered the journals carefully, along with the legal documents and Blackwood's final letter. These were part of the property now, part of what he'd bought for $500. The story of a man who'd lost everything and spent 40 years too afraid to try rebuilding. Caleb understood that story intimately because it was almost his own. He'd spent the last 23 years protecting himself, keeping his head down, avoiding risks. And where had it gotten him? To 58 years old with nothing but resentment and $500. The gold gave him a chance to be different. Not to be safe, but to be brave. Not to control others, but to trust them. Not to get revenge, but to build something that would outlast his own pain. It was a terrifying thought, and it went against every instinct he'd developed over decades of disappointment. But Silas Blackwood had left him more than gold. He'd left him a choice, repeat the same mistakes or risk something different. Caleb looked at the broken house around him, at the journals in his hands, at the valley spreading out in the evening light. Everything was broken here. Everything needed rebuilding. But maybe that was the point. You couldn't build something new on top of something old without tearing down what didn't work first. He thought about the hotel, about Martha, about revenge. Those thoughts felt small now, petty, like spending a fortune on the locks for doors that no longer needed protecting. What if he used the gold for something bigger, something that would have made Blackwood proud, that would justify the lonely man's faith in human nature? The idea was forming, uncertain but growing stronger. It would require trusting people. It would require risk. It would require becoming someone different than who he'd been. But then again, he'd already become someone different the moment he swung that sledgehammer into the porch column. The question was whether he had the courage to keep changing. Over the next 3 weeks, Caleb made 7 trips to Cheyenne. Each time he brought a few gold coins, never more than 5, never to the same bank twice. He opened accounts at 3 different institutions, spreading the wealth carefully. By the end of the 3rd week, he had nearly $3,000 in legitimate, accessible funds. The transformation of Crow's Nest began in earnest. Caleb hired Sam Fletcher, a carpenter from Cedar Bluff who'd fallen on hard times. Fletcher was in his 40s, skilled with his hands, but had been drinking too much since his wife died. Most people avoided him, assuming he was unreliable. Caleb offered him steady work at fair wages with one condition: show up sober. Fletcher had looked at him with red-rimmed eyes and said, "Why would you trust me?" "Because someone has to," Caleb had answered. "And I'm willing to be wrong if it means you're willing to try." Fletcher showed up sober every day after that. They started with the foundation, digging out rotted timbers and replacing them with new stone. Then came the roof, the walls, the windows. Caleb bought lumber from Ben Parker, glass from Thomas Whitmore, nails and tools from suppliers in Cheyenne who didn't ask questions about where a man his age got money for such ambitious projects. The work was hard and slow. Caleb's hands developed new calluses over old scars, and he went to sleep each night bone-tired but satisfied. He was building something real, something that would last beyond his own life. The house rose from ruin day by day, room by room, nail by nail. Ben Parker came out to visit after the first week, bringing supplies and curiosity. He walked around the property, examining the new foundation, the stacked lumber, the organized work site. Fletcher was up on scaffolding, replacing roof boards while Caleb steadied the ladder. "This is impressive work," Ben said when Caleb climbed down. "Must be costing you a small fortune." "I'm managing," Caleb said carefully. "That family money you mentioned finding must have been a substantial inheritance." "Substantial enough." Ben studied him for a long moment. "Folks in town are wondering. Martha's been asking questions. She seems to think you pulled off some kind of confidence scheme. I bought property at a public auction and started fixing it up. There's no scheme. I know that, but Martha doesn't want to." "Know that? She wants you to fail, Caleb. She's invested in you being the man who made a terrible decision out of spite. You succeeding makes her look foolish. That's not my problem anymore." "Maybe not, but she's making it everyone else's problem. She's been to Judge Morrison twice, trying to find some legal angle to challenge the sale. She's talking to anyone who'll listen about how suspicious your sudden wealth is." Ben paused. "I'm not telling you this to worry you. I'm telling you because you should know what's being said." After Ben left, Caleb sat on the partially rebuilt porch and thought about Martha. He'd been avoiding thinking about her, focusing on the work, on the physical labor that kept his mind occupied. But she wasn't going to disappear just because he wanted her to. That evening, he took Blackwood's journals out and read through them again, paying special attention to the passages about trust and fear. Blackwood had spent 40 years running from his problems, hiding from consequences, protecting himself from phantom threats. In the end, he died alone and bitter, his gold unused, his potential unfulfilled. Caleb didn't want that ending. The next morning, he rode into Cedar Bluff and went directly to the hotel where Martha lived. Chester Hall was behind the desk, looking older and more tired than the last time Caleb had seen him. "Mr. Hall," Caleb said, "I understand you're still looking to sell this hotel." Hall perked up immediately. "I am indeed. Are you interested?" "I might be. What are your terms?" They talked for 30 minutes. Hall wanted $8,000 for the building and business, $500 down and the rest in payments over 2 years. He was desperate enough that he'd negotiate, but not so desperate that he'd give it away. "I'll give you $6,000 cash, paid in full within 2 weeks, Caleb said. "No payments, no interest, just a clean sale." Hall's eyes widened. $6,000, that's quite a bit lower than my asking price. It's also guaranteed money right now, not a promise of payments over 2 years that might not come. At your age, Mr. Hall, isn't certainty worth something? Hall thought about it for exactly 10 seconds. "You have a deal. When can you have the money?" 2 weeks. I need to liquidate some assets. "But I'll put $500 down today as a deposit." They shook hands, and Caleb went to the bank to arrange the transfer. Albert Sutton processed the deposit with professional courtesy and thinly veiled curiosity. "Purchasing the hotel, I hear," Sutton said. "That's quite an investment for someone who just bought a condemned property." "Things change," Caleb said simply. "Indeed they do." Sutton completed the paperwork, though I imagine some people will have questions about how things changed so quickly. People can ask whatever questions they like. The answers are my business. As Caleb left the bank, he nearly collided with Martha on the boardwalk. She stopped short, her face going pale when she recognized him. "Caleb, Martha." An awkward silence stretched between them. Finally, Martha said, "I heard you're making improvements to that property. People are talking about where you got the money. People talk about a lot of things. Judge Morrison says there's no legal grounds to challenge the auction sale, that the property is legitimately yours." She sounded like the words tasted bitter. "But that doesn't explain your sudden wealth." "I found resources I didn't know I had." "That's all?" "Resources." Martha's eyes narrowed. "Is that what we're calling it?" Caleb took a deep breath, remembering Blackwood's final letter. "Do not let fear rule your decisions. Trust someone. Take a risk." "Martha, I want to show you something. Will you come out to Crow's Nest?" "Tomorrow morning?" She looked suspicious immediately. "Why would I do that?" "Because I owe you an explanation. Not legally. I don't owe you anything legally. But for the sake of the 5 years we were married, for the sake of honesty, I want to show you what I found and explain what I'm planning to do with it." "What you found?" Understanding dawned on her face. "You found something on that property. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Just you. No lawyers, no witnesses. Just 2 people who used to mean something to each other, having an honest conversation." Martha studied his face for a long moment. "I'll be there. But if this is some kind of trick, it's not a trick. It's just the truth. Something I should have been brave enough to tell you 23 years ago." He walked away before she could respond, his heart pounding. He'd just done something either very wise or very stupid. He wasn't sure which. But it felt right in a way that buying the hotel to control her never had. Back at Crow's Nest, he explained to Fletcher what he was planning. Fletcher listened carefully, his weathered face thoughtful. "You're taking a big risk telling her," Fletcher said. "She could cause you all kinds of trouble." "She could, but keeping secrets and protecting myself, that's what destroyed Silas Blackwood. I won't let it destroy me. What if she tries to claim the gold, says it should have been disclosed in the auction? Then I'll fight her legally, and I'll probably win. The property was sold as is, contents included, but I don't think that's what will happen. I think when she sees what I'm building here, when she understands what I'm trying to do, she might surprise me." "You have more faith in human nature than I do," Fletcher said. "Maybe, or maybe I'm just tired of living like I don't." That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay in his bedroll in the barn. The house still wasn't livable despite the progress. and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would determine a lot. If Martha reacted badly, if she went to the authorities, if she tried to cause legal trouble, it could undermine everything he was building. But if she surprised him, if she showed even a glimmer of the woman he'd fallen in love with 40 years ago, someone capable of seeing beyond her own immediate wants, then maybe there was hope for both of them to become better than they'd been. The journals were stacked beside his bedroll. He'd read them so many times he could practically recite passages from memory. Blackwood's words about trust and fear and courage had become a kind of scripture for him, a guide for how to live differently than he had before. Trust is the foundation of everything worthwhile. Caleb repeated the phrase like a prayer. Tomorrow he'd find out if he'd learned the lesson well enough, or if he was just a foolish old man making the same mistakes in a different way. Either way, he wouldn't know until he tried. Dawn came slowly, the sun taking its time climbing over the eastern hills. Caleb made coffee, worked on the house until 8:30, then washed up and changed into clean clothes. At exactly 9 o'clock, he heard a wagon approaching along the territorial road. Martha had come. He walked out to meet her, his heart steady now, his mind clear. Whatever happened next would happen, but at least he'd chosen it consciously, chosen to trust instead of fear, to risk instead of protect. That alone made him different than the man he'd been a month ago. That alone made Silas Blackwood's sacrifice worth something. Martha climbed down from the wagon slowly, her eyes taking in the transformed property. The new roof gleamed in the morning sun. Fresh lumber framed what would become new windows. The foundation stones were solid and level. Even in its partially completed state, Crow's Nest looked nothing like the wreck she'd mocked 4 weeks ago. "You've been busy," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Come inside," Caleb said. "There's something I need to show you." He led her through what would become the main room, stepping carefully around tools and materials. The interior was still rough. Bare studs where walls would go, exposed beams overhead. But the bones of a good house were visible. Martha followed silently, her expensive dress looking out of place among the sawdust and construction debris. In the back bedroom, Caleb had set up a simple table and 2 chairs. On the table sat Blackwood's trunk, open to reveal the journals and documents inside. "Sit down," Caleb said, pulling out a chair for her. Martha sat, suspicion written clearly on her face. "What is this, Caleb?" He sat across from her and picked up the first journal. This belonged to Silas Blackwood, the man who built this house. He died 4 years ago, and everyone in Cedar Bluff assumed he was just another crazy hermit. But he wasn't. Caleb opened the journal to the first page. He was a banker from San Francisco who was betrayed by his partner and fled west with his life savings. "Read this." He passed the journal across the table. Martha took it reluctantly, her eyes scanning the page. As she read, her expression shifted from suspicion to interest to something like understanding. Caleb let her read in silence, watching emotions play across her face. After 10 minutes, she looked up. He was innocent. He spent 40 years in exile for something he didn't do. Yes. And his savings. She glanced at the trunk, pieces clicking into place. He hid money here. Gold coins, $10,000 worth, hidden in the porch columns. I found them the first day when I started tearing down the porch. Caleb leaned forward. "Martha, I didn't buy this property knowing there was gold. I bought it to spite you, to keep you from getting my last $500. I was angry and stubborn and probably foolish. But I bought it legally, at public auction, and everything on the property became mine, including the gold." Martha set down the journal, her hands trembling slightly. $10,000. "Yes, and you're telling me this because I'm tired of secrets, because I read Blackwood's story and realized I was becoming him, a man so afraid of being hurt that he trusts nothing and no one. He died alone in this house, surrounded by wealth he was too frightened to use." Caleb picked up Blackwood's final letter. He left a message for whoever found the gold. He said, "Don't make his mistake. Don't let fear rule your decisions. Trust someone. Take a risk." He handed her the letter. Martha read it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she absorbed the words. When she finished, she set it down carefully, as if it were something precious. "Why are you showing me this?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because you asked about my sudden wealth, and you deserved an honest answer." Because I want you to understand what I'm doing with the money. And because, he paused, choosing his words carefully, because I need to know if the woman I married 40 years ago is still in there somewhere, or if we've both become people too damaged to recognize kindness when we see it. Tears welled in Martha's eyes, surprising both of them. Caleb, I've spent 23 years being angry at you. Angry that you couldn't give me the life I wanted. Angry that you weren't someone different. Angry at myself for choosing you and then resenting the choice. She wiped at her eyes impatiently. When you bought this property, instead of giving me that money, I was furious, but I was also relieved, because it meant I could stop pretending I was the victim of your failure and admit I failed too. Caleb sat back, surprised. This wasn't the Martha he'd been expecting. I heard you were buying the hotel, she continued. I assumed you were doing it to become my landlord, to get some kind of revenge. Chester told me this morning you offered him $6,000 cash. I was going to buy it for that reason, Caleb admitted. Revenge seemed like justice at the time, but then I read Blackwood's journals and realized revenge is just fear dressed up as strength. He met her eyes. I'm still buying the hotel, Martha, but not to control you. I have a different plan now, one that might surprise you. Tell me, she said. Caleb stood and walked to the window opening, looking out at the valley. I'm going to turn the hotel into a boarding house for people who need a second chance. Working men who've fallen on hard times. Women escaping bad situations. Anyone who needs a safe place to rebuild their lives. He turned back to Martha. I'll charge enough to cover expenses, but nothing more. No profit, no luxury, just basic dignity and a roof over their heads. Martha stared at him. That's not a business plan. You'll lose money. I have money, more than I need thanks to Blackwood. What I don't have is a legacy worth leaving behind. He gestured around the room. This house will be my home. The hotel will be my purpose. And maybe, if I do it right, someone will find their way back to themselves the way I'm trying to find my way back to who I could have been. What about me? Martha asked quietly. Where do I fit in this plan? That's up to you. You can stay at the hotel at the current rate, or you can pay the new reduced rate, or... He paused, meeting her eyes. Or you can help me run it. You're good with people when you want to be. You know how to manage a household. You could do real good if you chose to. You want me to work for you. I want you to work with me. Not as my employee, as a partner in something meaningful. Caleb pulled out a paper from his pocket. Notes he'd made the night before. Equal say in decisions. A salary that's fair. A chance to be part of something bigger than both of our past mistakes. Martha stood abruptly, walking to the opposite wall, her back to him. For a long moment, she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Do you know what the worst part of the last 23 years has been? Not the poverty, not the struggle, the purposelessness. I've spent 2 decades trying to extract value from others because I couldn't create value myself. I've been a parasite, Caleb. A bitter, angry parasite who convinced herself she deserved better while doing nothing to earn it. She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. When you bought this property instead of giving me that money, I hated you. But I also saw myself clearly for the first time in years. I saw what I'd become, and it was ugly. Caleb wanted to go to her, but stayed where he was, giving her space. We've both become ugly versions of ourselves. The question is whether we have the courage to become something better. Why would you trust me after everything I've done? Because Silas Blackwood left me a fortune with one request. Use it to build something based on trust instead of fear. If I can't extend that trust to the woman I once loved, then I'm just repeating his mistake with different details. Martha laughed, a sound halfway between humor and sorrow. You're either the bravest man I've ever known or the most foolish. Probably both, but I'd rather be foolishly brave than safely bitter. She crossed the room to him, stopping a few feet away. For the first time since he could remember, she looked at him without calculation, without measuring what she could gain. She just looked at him, really looked at him. I don't know if I can be the person you need me to be, she said. I don't need you to be anyone but honest, whatever that looks like. Caleb extended his hand. Partners. Martha stared at his hand for a long moment. He could see her wrestling with it, with decades of learned behavior, with the instinct to see offers as traps and trust as weakness. But then something shifted in her face. A decision made, a bridge crossed. She took his hand. Partners. They stood there in the half-finished room, two people who'd spent most of their lives running from or toward each other, finally standing still long enough to see what they could build together. "I have one condition," Martha said, not letting go of his hand. "What's that?" "The first person we help at the hotel. It should be Sam Fletcher. I've heard he's working for you. Heard he's staying sober. But he's living in a shack behind the lumber mill, and winter's coming. He deserves better." Caleb smiled, the first genuine smile he'd given Martha in more than 20 years. "That's a good condition. I accept it. Then we have a deal." She released his hand and looked around the room. "This is going to be harder than you think. People don't change easily. Neither do towns. We'll face resistance." "I know, but it's worth trying." "Yes," Caleb said. "It is." Outside, the sun climbed higher, warming the valley. Fletcher hammered somewhere on the roof, the steady rhythm of construction marking time. Inside, two old enemies became uncertain allies, both of them trying to figure out how to build something better than what they'd destroyed. 6 months later, Crow's Nest had a new name painted on a sign at the entrance to the property: Blackwood's Rest. The house stood complete, sturdy and weather-tight, with smoke rising from its chimney into the cold March air. The barn had been rebuilt. A chicken coop produced eggs. A vegetable garden waited for spring planting. The soil turned and ready. Caleb stood on his new porch. Solid now, built from honest timber with no secrets hidden inside, and watched the sun rise over the valley. At 59, he felt younger than he had at 58. Purpose did that to a person. So did honest work and clear conscience. The hotel in Cedar Bluff had been renamed too, Second Chance House. The sign above the door showed clasped hands, painted by a young woman who'd arrived 3 months ago, fleeing a violent husband. She was one of 7 people currently living there. Workers, wanderers, and people in transition, all trying to rebuild their lives with dignity instead of charity. Martha ran the house with surprising skill and unexpected compassion. She'd found her calling in organizing, in creating structure for people whose lives had become chaotic. She kept books meticulously, enforced rules fairly, and treated residents with respect they often hadn't experienced in years. The bitter woman who demanded Caleb's last $500 had transformed into someone he barely recognized, someone he was starting to respect. They weren't friends exactly. Too much history stood between them for easy friendship. But they were partners, and that counted for something, maybe more than friendship would have. Sam Fletcher had been the first resident of Second Chance House, just as Martha suggested. He'd stayed 3 months while building his savings and his sobriety, then moved into a small apartment above Ben Parker's feed store. Now he worked full-time as a carpenter, his reputation rebuilt along with his confidence. He still stopped by Crow's Nest twice a week, helping with maintenance and sharing coffee on the porch. "You gave me a chance when nobody else would," Fletcher had said once. "That means something, Caleb. Means everything, really." Caleb had learned that giving chances was easier than he'd thought. The hard part wasn't extending trust. It was dealing with his own fear that trust would be betrayed. But Blackwood's journals had taught him that betrayal was less dangerous than isolation, that being hurt was less tragic than never risking anything worth losing. Not everyone who came through Second Chance House succeeded. 2 residents had left in the night without paying, taking whatever they could carry. One man had returned to drinking despite Martha's patient counsel. But more had succeeded than failed, and the successes made the failures bearable. Ben Parker had been right. People in town did talk. Some called Caleb foolish for giving away his wealth. Others whispered that he must have stolen the gold, that no honest man came into money that easily. But enough people supported the effort that Second Chance House stayed full. And Blackwood's Rest became known as a place where a man could rebuild without judgment. Judge Morrison came out one afternoon in February, ostensibly to check on property lines, but really to satisfy his curiosity. He'd walked through the house with Caleb, nodding approval at the craftsmanship, asking careful questions about the finances. "You're spending more than you're bringing in," Morrison said finally. "That's not sustainable. I have resources," Caleb replied. "Enough to keep this running for years if I'm careful. And then what? Then I'll have built something worth building. Legacy isn't about how much you leave behind. It's about whether what you leave behind makes things better." Morrison had smiled at that, a rare, genuine smile. Silas Blackwood would have liked you, I think. He was a good man before life made him cautious. Life makes all of us cautious, Caleb said. The trick is knowing when caution becomes cowardice. Now, standing on his porch in the early morning light, Caleb thought about that conversation. 6 months ago, he'd been prepared to spend his last $500 on spite. Now he'd spent nearly all of Blackwood's gold on purpose, and he felt wealthier than he ever had when the coins sat hidden in his barn. He heard a wagon approaching and recognized Martha's rig. She'd taken to visiting once a week, bringing news from town and discussing the house business. She pulled up to the porch and climbed down, looking tired but satisfied. "We're full again," she said without preamble. "Young couple with a baby, fleeing debt collectors in Cheyenne. They need 3 months to get stable. We'll make room," Caleb said. "We always do." Martha climbed the porch steps and accepted the coffee Caleb offered. They stood side by side, looking out at the valley, comfortable now in a way that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. "Do you regret it?" Martha asked suddenly. "Spending the gold on this instead of keeping it for yourself?" Caleb thought about the question seriously. He thought about the money in his bank accounts, less than $1,000 now after all the building and donations. He thought about the people who'd passed through Second Chance House, the ones who'd found their footing and moved on to better lives. He thought about Sam Fletcher hammering on somebody's roof in town, sober and employed. He thought about the woman who'd painted the sign, now working as an apprentice to an artist in Laramie. "Not for a second," he said. Blackwood spent 40 years protecting his gold and died alone with all of it intact. "I'd rather die broke, having actually used it for something." "We won't let you die broke," Martha said with a slight smile. "I've been saving from my salary. When your gold runs out, I'll have enough to keep the house running for another year at least." Caleb looked at her, genuinely surprised. "You've been saving. Someone has to be practical. And besides," she paused, seeming to struggle with the words, "this matters, Caleb. What we're building here matters more than I thought anything could. I'm not ready to let it end just because the gold runs out." They stood in silence for a moment, watching steam rise from their coffee cups into the cold air. "Sometimes the worst decisions turn out to be the best," Caleb said finally, echoing the words from the story's beginning. "Sometimes a man's last dollar becomes his greatest fortune. And sometimes," Martha added quietly, "the people we've written off surprise us, including ourselves." The sun cleared the eastern hills, flooding the valley with golden light. In Cedar Bluff, Second Chance House was waking up, people starting their days with hope instead of desperation. At Blackwood's Rest, a man who'd been prepared to die bitter had found purpose instead. The gold was almost gone, but the fortune remained. That was the real treasure Silas Blackwood had hidden. Not coins in porch columns, but the possibility that trust could rebuild what fear had destroyed. Caleb raised his coffee cup toward the valley, a silent toast to a man he'd never met, but whose wisdom had saved them both. "Thank you, Silas," he said softly. Martha raised her cup too, understanding without explanation. "Thank you." And in the warming light of morning, two people who'd spent decades hurting each other finally learned what it meant to build something together worth more than all the gold in Wyoming.